Today's lecture, Crafted by Women, will be presented by Emily Zilber. Zilber is the editor of Metalsmith magazine, an award-winning journal focused on art and design in contemporary jewelry and metalsmithing. She's also the founding editor of Metalsmith Tech, a companion publication focused on technique, educational philosophies, professional development for artists, and new technologies in jewelry and metalsmithing, which will debut in 2018. She has a little bit of overlap in her work here because she's got 2 more weeks left as an MFA employee. So between 2010 and 2017, Zilber was the Museum of Fine Arts' first Ronald C. and Anita L. Warnick curator of contemporary decorative arts. She was responsible for the MFA's vibrant program of contemporary decorative arts, including guiding acquisitions, planning numerous exhibitions, and developing a presence for craft and design throughout the museum. Zilber was part of the team that opened the new Lindy Family Wing for Contemporary Art in 2011, and at the same time created and oversaw the Daphne and Peter Farrago Gallery, a space for modern and contemporary craft and decorative arts. She was previously assistant curator at the Cranbrook Art Museum at Cranbrook Academy of Art in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, where she organized numerous exhibitions and artist projects. Emily graduated from the University of Chicago with a BA in art history and received a master's from the Bard Graduate Center for Decorative Arts, Design History, and Material Culture. I'll have to say, Emily, I will miss you very much, but I know that I will have you back to do lectures often. So thank you so much for joining us today, and please join me in welcoming Emily Zilber.
Hello, everyone. I am thrilled to be here with you this morning, and I'm jealous that you had a chance to sit through all of the other lectures in this series. I hope that this coda will, bring the story full circle and also prompt you to continue to look at and seek out the stories of female artists and makers. So over the past century, numerous female artists, patrons, and scholars have been essential to the field of studio craft. They've taken materials traditionally associated with women's labor and domestic spaces and rethought their meaning and purpose. Or they've redefined and recontextualized ways of making that were dismissed by mainstream of modern art. Or they've entered into areas of the craft world that were thought of as exclusively for male makers. From weaving and sewing and quilting to furniture making, to ceramics, to creating wearable and functional jewelry, female artists have recast the narrative of their chosen craft and given conceptual integrity to different ways of making. While there are so many artists and supporters I could talk about, today I'm going to focus on 4 case studies of women who have shaped craft's place in the 20th century American experience, and for 2 artists pictured here into the 21st century. So I'm looking here at patron Aileen Osborn Webb, ceramist Toshiko Takaezu, furniture maker Wendy Maruyama, and fiber artist Sonya Clark. I'll end with a coda of 2 relatively recent acquisitions into the museum's collection of craft works by women artists that speak to the diversity of younger female artists creating objects in the field today. I want to take a quick step back for a moment, however, before we begin to talk about works of contemporary craft and speak a little bit more about the larger context which the studio craft movement came from. The roots of studio craft lie in the arts and crafts movement, originally beginning in England in the mid-19th century as a reaction to the Industrial Revolution and the ensuing dehumanization of labor, as well as arguments that objects mass-produced in factories were of poor quality and taste and impacting the lives and morale of the people who used and consumed them. The movement emphasized a return to hand craftsmanship and beautiful design for everyday functional objects. Women played a significant role here, and I'm showing 2 embroidered bed hangings by May Morris, the daughter of William Morris. She's pictured here in the center. William Morris was one of the major proponents and theorists of the movement in England. Each of these bed hangings is an everyday good meant to enliven and beautify life, and it is certainly hard to imagine waking up to one of these on your bed and having a bad day. The arts and crafts movement and the accompanying interest in a return to traditional craftsmanship eventually spread to the United States and in various forms throughout the world. Boston was a center of the American arts and crafts movement, and our own Society of Arts and Crafts here in town was the first in the nation. Women, hereto Boston makers, were an important part of this conversation, so I'm showing, both from the MFA's collection, Elizabeth Ethel Copeland's box on the left, and a teacup sort of picture made by the Paul Revere pottery of the Saturday Evening Girls Club. So again, female makers who are involved with the conversation. I'm also showing here a very early image of the MFA hosting a Society of Arts and Crafts exhibition at the museum in 1913, from which we purchased this brooch by a female maker, Josephine Hartwell Shaw. So the MFA was collecting works by female artists early in the arts and crafts movement. Studio craft is said to have developed as an outgrowth of the GI Bill, which gave educational funding to returning soldiers after the war. I'm showing here an image from a 1944 exhibition in New York titled The Hands of Servicemen. This sought to show crafts that were made by wounded soldiers at Halloran Hospital in Staten Island in New York by the Arts and Crafts Unit of the Red Cross. And so making crafts was also thought of as therapeutic, not just a way to give returning soldiers from the war a chance to make a different kind of life for themselves through study. Servicemen and women entered college on the GI Bill, looking to develop skills in studio arts. There was a rapid growth in post-secondary programs in ceramics, fiber, metal, and wood in the 1940s and 50s, resulting in large numbers of trained craftspeople and artists entering the scene. At the same time, an expanded global vision led to an interest in art forms that were outside of the fine arts hierarchy, so outside of that privileging of painting and sculpture. Men and women from all walks of life rediscovered and reinvigorated traditional media in order to express themselves, often as a means of personal rebellion against the homogeneity and mass production prevalent in American society. And I think you can see how that links to that earlier concern about the way that industrialization was impacting the things that we used in our everyday lives. They set up studios in which they created one-of-a-kind functional pieces, as well as artworks that incorporated craft skills and materials, and this explosion of interest in craft came to be called the studio craft movement. So typically, the epitome of this movement is seen as somebody like Peter Volkus, and I'm showing his Camelback Mountain, which is on view upstairs. Veteran came back to school on the GI Bill, and we are looking here at his very masculine making of ceramics, right? So that's the sort of typical narrative that we often get. However, it's difficult to begin any conversation about women in studio craft, and certainly in the arts and crafts era in the United States, without including the art patron and philanthropist Aileen Osborn Webb. Webb was born in Garrison, New York, in 1892 to wealthy parents with a long history of supporting the arts, and I'm actually showing here her coming out photograph from New York in 1910. Her paternal grandfather had been an early force in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and her father, William Church Osborn, became the president of the Board of Trustees between 1941 and 1948. He bequeathed to the museum most of his private collection. Her uncle, Henry Fairfield Osborn, was the president of the American Museum of Natural History. Aileen married Vanderbilt Webb, a lawyer and heir to the Vanderbilt shipping and railroad fortune in 1912, just 2 years after we see this photograph, and collected there to another philanthropic family with a connection to the arts. So her sister-in-law, Electra Havermeyer Webb, would establish the Shelburne Museum in Vermont in 1947. I'm assuming that many folks have been there and have, whether they knew it or not, some relationship to the Vanderbilt Webb family here. Over her life, Webb was able to use her influence to convince other powerful art patrons that craft had inherent merit and depth, and that it was an important part of America's national heritage, fighting to earn a position for craft within the art world. She also grew up with people who prized committed and not just cursory contributions to improve society. And it was through this example of her family that she was encouraged to pursue a cause that she believed in, which happened to be craft. So by the dawn of the Depression, she had found her life's work, helping to develop the status of crafts within the United States, as she said. In 1929, she formed a marketing group with friends in her home of Garrison, New York, for, and quote unquote, selling whatever a person living in Putnam County could make or produce. The timing was noteworthy. The US was on the brink of economic meltdown, and Webb saw the need to help struggling Americans, and she thought that craft could do this. She admired the self-sufficient nature of craft production, as well as the inherent artistic spirit in the wares. And so this initial effort was the origin of Putnam County products, and you're seeing some advertisements and newspaper clippings here from the time. This is a shop that they opened and expanded in that part of New York State in 1936 and 1937. Putnam became a home industry program through which Webb and her colleagues marketed agricultural products, quilts, pottery, and other handmade and traditional wares produced in rural areas and urban centers in the Northeast. In 1939, in August, Webb hosted a small group of representatives from various regional craft leagues and guilds at her summer home in Vermont, and the result there was the formation of the Handcraft Cooperative League of America. In forming that league, Webb managed to unite smaller craft groups and begin the drive for a national craft movement. So this is also all before we have this advent of folks coming on the GI Bill to study craft in universities. So in 1940, they incorporated in New York and focused on their goal of opening distribution channels for crafts in metropolitan centers. Webb and her advocates believed that if people could have a better understanding of handmade objects and more access to them, crafts would thrive and have an influence on mass-produced design. She was also driven by the simple notion of bringing beauty into people's homes and lives. So as a result, the League established America House in 1940 as a cooperative shop at 7 East 54th Street in New York, where American-made crafts could be purchased. And you see here in an early photo of American House, the sort of eagle. It's a very patriotic thing to buy crafts. Operating during World War II, and I'm showing here the exterior of America House and an advertisement that was done to show the store. The vitality of the crafts movement in the United States is revealed in its presentations. America House was partially motivated by this patriotic idea of supporting through purchase goods and objects made by Americans using traditional methods, local materials, and historic techniques. Webb avidly believed in this kind of moralizing power of handiwork, feeling that the more crafts that sold, the more people's lives would improve, not only on this kind of economic level for the artists, but on a deeper level of meaning for the purchasers as well. So in the beginning, the objects were taken on consignment, and the shop was, as I said, run as a cooperative, and I'm showing here some catalog images from the late 1940s, where you can see here a 1946 exhibition, The Master Craftsmen of Tomorrow. This was all makers under 30 who were shown. And then a page here of different kinds of ceramics. Everyone who was involved in the beginning had a $2 share of stock in the store. It became a corporation in 1951. Craftsmen were asked to submit their work through the group or league, through their individual group or sort of guild, to ensure that only the best was sent to the shop. But by 1943, this had changed, and craftsmen began to submit their work directly, and it became more like a gallery model. To help regulate prices and ensure that buyers in search of the best American crafts would always come to America House, makers were expected to make the shop the sole outlet for their work. So they were very business savvy as well. America House took root during the war years, but truly flourished in the post-war boom era. And I'm showing here some later pictures of America House at a different location, and you can really see how sort of slick and beautiful it's become. America House went through 3 different relocations and operated for 30 years. The roster of artists who sold through or supported America House reads like a who's who in American crafts. Elsa Freund, Michael Coffey, Wharton Eschrick, Wendell Castle, Paul Evans, Paolo Soleri, Earl Pardon, and Marguerite Wildenhain, just to name a few. And I don't know if you saw in this previous, you can see Marguerite Wildenhain her stoneware is pictured here, Marion Edwin Shire, Beatrice Wood, all artists who are now in the MFA collection and thought of as real champions and icons of the American studio craft movement. So the shop finally closed at 44 West 53rd Street in 1971, but only after its success had created a market for craft and inspired hundreds of craft outpost galleries and shops to open across the country. America House was indeed the first retail shop selling American craft in New York City. In 1942, Webb joined forces with another leading group championing craft at the time, the American Handicraft Council. This was founded by Anne Morgan, the daughter of J. Pierpont Morgan. The two organizations had related goals. Webb's league, with the participation of a broad coalition of craftsmen, was dedicated to promoting and distributing rural crafts to urbanites, whereas Morgan's council concentrated more on teaching and craft study. As the American Craftsmen's Cooperative Council, Webb hoped that they could hold more workshops that would raise awareness and also train new craftsmen in America's House's building on Madison Avenue. So to effectively provide education in handcrafts and to further stimulate public interest in and appreciation of the work of handcraftsmen, the American Craftsmen Educational Council was created in 1943. And here it's because Webb's wish was that aspiring craftsmen could receive sort of legitimate academic training, not just through a guild system, and learn essential skills at top American universities. She hoped that by expanding these kinds of educational opportunities, people would learn to create higher quality objects. So this morphed into the School for American Craftsmen at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, which opened in 1944. And I'm showing here an early ad. You can write there for full particulars. It symbolized that craft training was not merely a technical vocation, but rather it placed it alongside the fine arts, design, and engineering in the realm of academia. The school briefly shifted to Alfred University in New York in the summer of 1946, but since 1949, it's been a part of the Rochester Institute of Technology, where it's flourished and helped spawn similar programs at other American universities. And I'm showing here an ad, a 1953 ad for the School for American Craftsmen when it was at RIT. In keeping with its mission to publicize and increase visibility for the crafts, the council started printing an early newsletter for members that became a vehicle for reaching a general audience who wanted to stay informed about the craft world. The newsletter quickly developed into an actual magazine. The first true issue of Craft Horizons, which I'm showing on the left here, was published in May 1942 with 3,500 copies. And this was the predecessor to the widely available American Craft magazine, which I bet that some of you have picked up when you've been in a Barnes & Noble. The council, which in 1955 renamed itself the American Craftsmen's Council, closer to its current moniker of the American Craft Council, so this organization is still in operation today, also began to sponsor and promote exhibitions of craft, including, I'm showing here, the important juried exhibition, Designer Craftsman USA in 1953. I'm showing it, it traveled widely, but I'm showing it here when it was installed at the Brooklyn Museum in New York, as well as the cover for the catalog, which is a lot of fun if you are so inclined to pick it up. This brought together the work of top craftspeople from across the United States into one comprehensive forum for the first time in American history. And so we're looking at 243 works by 203 craftsmen were included. So really a broad swath, and many of the names that you'll see in that catalog are the names that we think of, again, as the foundational figures in studio craft today. Webb always tried to create opportunities for like-minded artists and to unify the craft community through meetings and gatherings. One of the more significant events that she put together was the council-organized first National American Craftsman Conference held in Asilomar in California in 1957. Showing here the cover of the program. 450 people attended, pretty good. And I'm showing here an image that includes the fiber artist Lenore Tawney at front, the fiber artist Jack Leonard Larson, and Ani Alpers, so big names in the field. The series of conferences followed this one from 1960 into the late 1970s, Numerous regional conferences, programs, and workshops were held that followed the council's model, and many independent regional groups and organizations expanded and emerged. The council was invited also to select 130 craft objects to include in the U.S. pavilion of the Brussels World Fair in 1958. And this was a tremendous opportunity to push the place of American craft in the global spotlight. So Webb was aware that American crafts needed to be promoted beyond home in order for them to become fully validated. She wanted to have a sort of global conversation earlier, I think, than a lot of folks in the field were thinking about this as a global conversation. With that said, in 1964, Webb and the council got more ambitious and invited craftsmen from all over the globe to participate in an international conference at Columbia University. The first World Congress of Craftsmen brought together artists, collectors, scholars, and curators, and their goal was to form a World Crafts Council. Webb began thinking about the concept with a colleague named Margaret Patch in 1962, and hoped that by opening up these channels of communication and creating opportunities for the group to convene, she could enrich cultural understanding and exchange. On a leadership front, councils in other countries, including Canada, Australia, and the US, were formed, and they patterned themselves after the American Crafts Council. And so you're seeing a photograph of that first meeting here with signs denoting the different delegations, very formal. In 1977, Mrs. Webb noted about her intentions for this, and I'm quoting her here. The purpose of the World Crafts Council was much the same worldwide as that of the ACC nationwide. It had one additional purpose, to bring the people of the world more closely together as individual friends and to help build an atmosphere conducive to peace. No small goal here. There are now 86 member countries, and if it seems possible that China and the USSR should ever ask to be members, we ourselves, the craftsmen of the world, could, united, be a tremendous force for good. This, I realize, is more like stargazing than anything else. But I hope the reader will pardon an old lady who dreams that where there is an ideal offered, it can be made to come about. So I think strangely timely, but this notion that philanthropy and support, especially support of artists, could really change the world was very much a part of Webb's involvement with building this kind of infrastructure for the crafts and support. Arguably, Webb and the Council's most important contribution by far was the Museum of Contemporary Crafts, which opened September 20th, 1956, in a renovated brownstone at 29 West 53rd Street in New York. The building was beside MoMA, thus placing it symbolically on par with the prestigious art institution. As a result of its previous work and achievements, Webb and the Council recognized the need to find a permanent site other than a store like America House, where the public could see craft objects in that kind of gallery setting. So through the new showplace and office space, the Council hoped to raise awareness about the highly advanced level of work that American craftsmen were doing by the mid-1950s and show how contemporary handmade crafts could enhance modern life in an age of machine-made goods. And so I'm showing here a model by the architect David Campbell for the museum, a scale model here. The opening of the museum right in the heart of New York City, near these established major art institutions, was a monumental achievement for the status and legacy of American crafts and their role in the larger culture. So the museum made its debut, again in 1956, with a show called Craftsmanship in a Changing World. It's still a good title, we could do that now. And I'm showing here Mrs. Webb unpacking some of the objects for the exhibition with an assistant at the museum. The objects that were included displayed a mastery of technique and an appreciation of various traditional craft materials like ceramics, fiber, glass, metal, and wood. Here's a shot of the interior of that show. You'll notice it actually doesn't look all that different from some of the shots of America House that I showed you, so there certainly was a prevailing aesthetic at the time. The show included 184 artists, and I will say 109 were men and 75 were women. So it's actually not too bad in terms of parity. There are certainly big museums that do quite a bit worse than that today. Most of them had indeed exhibited or sold through America House, so there was a relationship there. Acquisitions at the museum from 1956 to 1970 were evenly divided between men and women. Again, before its time. The museum began assembling its own permanent collection as soon as it opened and held its first single artist living craftsperson show on the woodworking master Wharton Eschrick that year, and they ushered in a wave of individual artist shows over the year. You all have likely been to this museum in New York. In 2002, it changed its name to the Museum of Arts and Design, reflecting the new position of craft and its integration with other broader disciplines of making. So I'm showing here a lovely image of Mrs. Webb at her potter's wheel. She also made work herself. The 1960s and 70s were a time when craft became this fertile branch within the arts. Craft schools, centers, and programs were thriving in many accounts as a result of the council's successes. Craft had entered into a kind of national conscience as a vital part of the art world and a really important expression of American national identity. In 1976, Webb resigned as the chair of the council and Barbara Rockefeller succeeded her. She died 3 years later in 1979, and the following period brought about several changes. Through the 1980s, the American Craft Council's work and its museum shows were the most vital of all craft institutions and really became a model for other arts organizations. They continued to try to spread craft abroad, and it still remains right now the primary national voice for the American craft community, including organizing major craft fairs and juried shows across the United States. It's also a specialized library and archival collection, recently relocated to Minneapolis from New York. So if you're ever in the Twin Cities and want to do a little research, I highly recommend their library. A wonderful photo of Mrs. Webb from a Christmas card in the late 1970s. I think it gives you a sense of the kind of spirit she was, in addition to all of the accomplishments that I've listed. We've got somebody who really wasn't afraid to take chances. Each year, the council presents the Aileen Osborn Webb Award to honor individuals and organizations that help advance the crafts. And it continues to develop educational strategies that elevate and expand people's ideas about crafts, which is certainly part of Mrs. Webb's vision and mission, allowing her legacy to live on in the museum in New York, in the council and its programs. The resurgence of interest in craft in the post-Second World War period in the US that Aileen Osborn Webb really helped a great deal to encourage and really established much of the infrastructure for, opened doors for other women to professionalize as artists, designers, and teachers in the field. Craft, with its implications of domesticity and tradition, as well as its marginalized status within the art world, provided an entryway for women into the professional world that often circumvented rigidly defined gender roles of the 1950s and 60s that would openly exclude them from or otherwise marginalize their work in certain kinds of other creative fields, say design. New courses in ceramics, textiles, and other craft media and techniques created stable teaching positions for women and opportunities for female students to explore their creativity in fields outside of these male-dominated areas of painting and sculpture. And so I'm going to move on to talk about one example of a female artist who made a life through teaching an innovative practice, Toshiko Takaezu. Takaezu was born in Pipiko, Hawaii. She was the 6th of 11 children of Japanese immigrants from Okinawa, and I'm showing here a family photo with Toshiko right there. Her parents had come to Hawaii to work in the sugarcane fields, and Takaezu helped her father and uncle farm watercress and raise honeybees. She left high school early to support her family, and during World War II, found work at the Hawaii Potters Guild, making functional vessels and keepsakes using press molds. So that was really her first introduction to ceramics. While auditing classes at the University of Hawaii in 1948, to continue her interest, she began to study ceramics a bit more in depth, and she met and began to study with the ceramics and glass artist Claude Horan, and also studied weaving and design. Horan pushed Takaezu to study on the mainland. and she studied with a female teacher. She was attracted to the work of the Finnish ceramic artist Maija Grotel. I'm showing here an early work of Grotel's that is actually in the MFA's collection and is thought to be a self-portrait. Grotel is herself a pioneer for women in craft, having come to the US in 1927 as one of many European immigrants who came to the United States before and after the Second World War and irreparably shaped the face of mid-century American craft by teaching in important workshops, artist communities, and teaching centers. From 1936 to 1938, Grotel became the first art instructor at the School of Ceramic Engineering at Rutgers University. So again, we're taking a very male-dominated field, and she came in and added her own flavor to it. Grotel went to Cranbrook Academy of Art in 1938, and I'm showing here some pictures of her at Cranbrook with the kinds of work she was making, in addition to another piece that's in the MFA collection and upstairs in our American wing, should you want to go see it after the talk today. She came to Cranbrook at the invitation of architect Aileen Osborn, who was the head of the program there, the Academy of Art, and she taught there until her retirement in 1966. She had a very particular teaching philosophy that would profoundly impact Toshiko Takaezu. I'm quoting Grotel here. "If you help a student too much, they are lost when they leave or you leave. The best thing you can do for students is to make them so independent that they do not miss you." In 1951, Takaezu enrolled in Cranbrook Academy of Art in order to study with Grotel, and she brought with her a supply of Hawaii's black volcanic sand to use in her work. Grotel became, as well as her teacher, her mentor, and during her 3 years there, Takaezu felt she had found her path, and I'm showing here some early works, functional works of Takaezu's. In addition to burnishing Takaezu's talents at the wheel and in the classroom, training at Cranbrook deepened her interest in weaving as a supplement to her artistic practice in clay, and we'll see a little bit more of that come in later on. She studied there with the Finnish weaver Marianne Strangell. Grotel passed on to her students this belief that ceramics was an art form that could be the equal of painting or sculpture, which was really just beginning to take hold as an idea. Takaezu tells us about her first involvement with clay, and I'm quoting her here. "I found it had so many possibilities. To be able to carry out my ideas, to make anything good, I had to have technique and discipline. I have disciplined myself in many ways in order to achieve my ideas. What is most important is to keep on working. You can't wait for inspiration because that may never come. Inspiration most often comes when I begin to work." Of her experience at Cranbrook, Takaezu said, "Hawaii is where I learned technique. Cranbrook was where I found myself." Following graduation in 1954, Takaezu began her teaching career. She taught at Cranbrook between 1954 and 1956, and then went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison to replace the father of studio glass, Harvey Littleton, who was also a student of Grotel's during his sabbatical. In 1955, Takaezu traveled to Japan for 8 months to immerse herself in her Japanese heritage. In addition to meeting renowned Japanese ceramic artists Shoji Hamada on the left and Rosanjin Kitai on the right, she lived in a Zen Buddhist monastery and studied aspects of Japanese culture like the tea ceremony. At the end of her stay, she believed she had found what she'd been searching for, that it was not Japanese or Eastern pottery itself, but the entire art and culture of the area that mattered to her, and in particular, the integration between art and life. Takaezu said in a later interview, and I'm quoting here, "In my life, I see no difference between making pots, cooking, and growing vegetables. They're all related. However, there is a need for me to work in clay. It is so gratifying, and I get so much joy from it, and it gives me any answers for my life." Upon returning to the US, she accepted a position at the Cleveland Institute of Art in Ohio, taking a year in 1958 to return to Hawaii to teach at the Honolulu Academy of Art. The 1950s then marks Takaezu's experimentation with functional wares into sort of more reductionist and sculptural forms. We're still seeing vases and vessels here, but you'll notice they have these double spouts. They've began to become sort of anthropomorphic, and they take on an abstract form. On a trip through New Jersey in the early 1960s, supported by a grant from the Lewis Comfort Tiffany Foundation, Takaezu fell in love with the area of rural Hunterdon County and was determined to set up a studio there. She took a leave of absence from Cleveland and bought a house in Clinton, New Jersey. And I'm showing here some later images of Takaezu at her studio in New Jersey. A series of grants allowed her to take a few years to establish this home and studio, which she relished for being far away from New York City, but not too far. When nearby Princeton University offered her a position in 1967, she accepted, and she taught there until the 1990s. In 1992, when she retired, she has an honorary doctorate from Princeton as well. In her teaching, Takaezu emulated her own mentors in encouraging her students to find their own voice and their own style. Until her passing in 2011, she was still in touch with former students and worked with apprentices at her New Jersey studio annually, so up until the end. As a teacher, Takaezu has influenced and taught hundreds of students, no doubt influenced by Grotel, having developed a teaching style which emphasized an individual's original thinking and skill development to manifest any idea. In an interview with Takaezu, we learned that she, quote, unquote, feels that her function as a teacher is to help the student retain the vigor and originality of his or her thinking. If a student fails to achieve an idea because he lacks the skill, I will help him build the technical skill so that he may be able to realize his concept in the future. In the 1960s, Takaezu began to throw reduced ceramic forms that came down to their basic roundness, almost closing them entirely. And in some ways, you see the sort of progression here. So we've got from that double-necked vase, we've moved to a sort of handle and a very small spout to almost closing the piece entirely. And Takaezu is really known as being one of the first ceramic artists to really close the vessel so that it became entirely sculpture. It left traces of functional origin through sort of openings at the top, but then ultimately closed entirely. Calling her work ceramic forms, Takaezu began to move away from functions. And so you can see utterly non-functional pieces here, sculptural works. She noted, I do not make a teapot and say this is for use. Form is my first concern. With her Moonscape series, so works I'm showing here, her spherical forms became more organic, emphasizing their roundness and fullness. Her signature closed shapes were appearing, these openings getting smaller until we don't see them at all, although still oftentimes works recalled their functional beginnings with a tiny opening at the top. As her works evolved, the pots became increasing in size, and I'm showing here two images of Takaezu in relationship to some of these large works. They were containers in a different sense, and instead of holding things, they held air or space. Takaezu has said about this work, the most important part of a piece is the dark, black air space that you can't see, just as inside each person is also the key to humanity. Her works also hold other things too. Takaezu made it a practice to include small clay pellets and inscribed poems in her pieces. So they remain hidden unless the piece is moved, and you might hear a soft ping of a piece of clay as it hits the inside of the piece, or if a piece breaks and a poem is revealed. In addition to spheres and other shapes reminiscent of nature, they appeared tree trunks and torsos. So I'm looking at some of her tree trunk works here and an installation of those works in the lava forest in Hilo in Hawaii. In the 1970s and 1980s, the sense of oneness with nature influenced Takaezu's pieces. And when she was asked about her method of working at this time, she said, and I'm quoting here, I don't move fast or drastically or change with the times or with what people are doing. I go at my own internal pace. Nothing is easy to get. What you believe in, you must work for and not be influenced by the outside. You must try to listen to what you are yourself. To promote even drying in her works, she suspended some of her larger forms in hammocks and was so taken with the effect that the hammock actually became part of the piece. And I like to think that this in some ways relates to her early study in fiber. And I think it's really interesting to look at in relationship to this wonderful image from 1974, Toshiko Takaezu on the left, and on the right, Lenore Tawney, who I mentioned as being at that Asilomar conference, a textile artist, a weaver, and here they are learning backstrap weaving in Guatemala. As Takaezu's pieces grew, they became too unwieldy for the wheel, and she began incorporating hand-building techniques to reach new heights, and I'm showing here that's kind of coil building and hand building. A larger studio and kiln encouraged her to experiment with pieces so large that the tiny artist had to stand on scaffolding to shape the clay and move around the piece, glazing and decorating. She said, "I like the idea of going around the piece and glazing. It's almost like dancing." Her surface decoration is striking. I'm showing here actually, this is a piece of Takaezu's, a number of pieces of Takaezu's in situ in her friend Lenore Tawney's loft in New York. And so with Lenore Tawney's work, I think there's a wonderful relationship between the two pieces. But this work really shows the surface decoration, this kind of painterly and abstract approach that led many of her friends and scholars to describe her as a painter working on clay. Takaezu pours, brushes, and drips the glazes. They're sometimes shiny, they're sometimes matte, and they're often sort of layered and marked. As part of a generation that moved ceramics from a functional craft to a sculptural form, Takaezu combined creative ability with a creative spirit. She noted, "You are not an artist simply because you paint or sculpt or make pots that cannot be used. An artist is a poet in his or her own medium, and when an artist produces a good piece, that work has mystery, an unsaid quality, it is alive. There is also a nebulous feeling in the piece that cannot be pinpointed in words. That, to me, is good work." And I'm sure we've all had that feeling in front of a really good piece of art. Wendy Maruyama, the furniture maker, began working a generation after Takaezu, but certainly benefited from artists like her, who shifted the boundaries and expectations around function and craft, and certainly around what a craft object was able to do or say. Born in a small farming town in Colorado in 1952, Maruyama is a third-generation Japanese American whose parents and grandparents faced the brutality of internment camps during World War II. And so we'll see as we talk about her work that she's equally affected by that experience as she is by being an American artist exploring her own Japanese heritage. Her early work combined ideologies of feminism and traditional craft objects using humor, social commentary, sculptural form, and color to challenge accepted notions of studio furniture. And her newer work moves beyond that into the boundaries between traditional studio craft and social practice. Maruyama studied woodworking at San Diego State University, where she got her BA in 1975. She was one of the first 2 women and the first deaf student to complete an MFA in furniture making at the Rochester Institute of Technology's School for American Crafts. In 1980, that same school that was founded and developed by the subject of our first case study, Aileen Osborn Webb. And so you're seeing here how these successive generations of women working in the field were able to provide support, whether directly or indirectly, for one another. It's notable that Maruyama's first woodworking teacher in junior college in California was a woman named Joanne Peterson. So she was exposed early to eschew boundaries between traditional gendered roles in making, furniture making, sort of traditionally being seen as a man's craft, woodworking as well. Maruyama also studied in San Diego with the important jewelry maker Arlene Fish, and I'm showing here a picture of Fish from that period and her work during that period, the 1970s, on the right. Fish was a tremendous model for a successful woman artist for Maruyama, and she notes, she was, A, not only a professor, but a professional metalsmith and a woman and traveling and giving lectures and having shows. At the same time, she cared very much about her students. It was like, forget this secretary business, I want to do this. Maruyama really got excited about crafts when exploring the idea that the functional object can take on a non-traditional appearance. It struck her as being a challenge and a lot of fun, and she says that after this kind of early study with Fish and with Peterson, she, and I'm quoting here, came away from that experience seeing craft as simply another art medium, and it would be painting and sculpture and craft together. But woodworking was, to me, a little more of a challenge because it was a little bit of a novelty, too, because it wasn't, at the time, especially not typical women's work, for one thing. I was always under the impression that woodworking was men's work. And to suddenly be able to take a course like this, I thought, this isn't so hard after all. What's the big deal? Then the fact that the scale was interesting. Working with furniture, it's much larger scale. The woodworking field seemed to me to have a great deal of potential for a woman. In 1976, Maruyama went to study with Alphonse Mathieu. I'm showing here, and work of his, The Architect's Valet. We have an example of that in the MFA's collection. It was her first time from the West Coast. She went to Virginia Commonwealth University to study with him. And at VCU, Maruyama began to feel that she didn't have the technical skills to really say what she wanted to in furniture. And so when Mathieu was hired to teach at the relatively new program in artisanry right here at Boston University shortly after, she decided to study there with him and Jerry Osgood. I'm showing him here and an image of his work, and build those abilities. In 1980, feeling as though she was ready for an MFA, she moved on to the School for American Crafts at RIT. Her earliest works in the 1970s, as in this 1976 coffee table, were typical of the style of the time in which she used sort of visible cabinet-making skills, compound bent lamination, and celebrated complex wood grains and types. Along with Roseanne Somerson and Gail Friedel, Maruyama was one of the first women to break into the field of studio furniture, responding to the sort of marginalization felt in a male-dominated field by making work that used this kind of complex joinery and technical processes. However, Maruyama later felt restricted by this type of highly technical furniture and began to make more expressive works during her time at RIT, and I'm showing here this really wonderful, colorful, fun salami tray from 1980. Everyone has one of these in their house, right? Maruyama and Friedel later shared a studio together in the mid-1980s when Maruyama taught in San Francisco. Maruyama's furniture design was influential in the early period of postmodern art furniture of the 1980s, when she challenged not only the male-dominated field of furniture making, but also sort of woodworking in general, by using humor, social commentary, and sculptural form to challenge traditional notions of furniture design. And I'm showing here her 1982 piece, A Mickey Macintosh Chair, which humorously pays homage to the cartoon character Mickey Mouse, but also speaks to the work of renowned Scottish designers Charles Rennie Mackintosh and Margaret MacDonald Mackintosh, who I'm showing here on the right. And so you can see that elongated back, the emphasis at the top of the chair. There's a relationship here, but Maruyama is bringing a great deal of humor and references to pop culture into her work. Believing in the art of furniture making, Maruyama stated, "I see furniture as an archetypal object that can be expressive of the times. Furniture is capable of setting a certain mood and reflecting common ideals in our lives." In her early career, she produced 15 to 20 pieces of furniture a year, and she continues to produce about 6 to 8 pieces every year now. The 1980s was an era of experimentation with form and aesthetics, where she used colored surfaces, angular forms, and multiple media. And I'm showing here a work of hers, a bedside box. So this opens at the top and is a storage container that's on the cover of a really wonderful history of American studio craft called Makers. I believe that I put that on your handout. But this piece, you can also see it, it's in the collection of the Fuller Craft Museum. Later in the 1980s, Maruyama entered what she describes as a white period of works that asked a compelling question, and also marked, I think, one of the first times where she began to bring political concerns into her work. After a nuclear holocaust, what form might our objects take? And so she's asking the question and answering it here through this post-nuclear primitive chair from 1986, which is in the collection of the MFA here, and you might have seen it when it was in the Farrago Gallery within the past couple of years. She sought to make a deliberate political statement against nuclear arms and imagined if, and I'm quoting her here, if the world were to survive a nuclear world and re-evolve, the forms would be very stark. The wood would have lost its color. This severe chair with its jagged edges and stark geometry is finished with white shoe polish to suggest this kind of cold, harsh, colorless world. And it's a departure from the kind of warmth and comfort that we typically think of when we think of studio furniture. In the 1990s, we see this interest in political work becoming much more personal. I'm showing here two cabinets, King of the Monsters on the left and Angry Asian Women on the right. It's a series of work developed from visits to Japan between 1994 and 2004, which triggered a memory from Maruyama's past and enabled her to look more into her heritage. The work addresses the contradictions of Japanese culture, and it references both old Japan and contemporary Japan, so ranging from samurai, Godzilla, Zen gardens, anime, ukiyo-e, and geishas. In 1995, Maruyama was on a fellowship grant in Kyoto, which inspired a series of work where she was also taking classes at Tokyo University of the Arts in lacquer work known as urushi, and many of the colors of the work that she was doing in this period, these bright colors, which have been a part of her work for a long time, were inspired by her study of urushi lacquer. With regard to gender, Maruyama's Men in Kimono series is particularly interesting. It incorporates old photos of kabuki actors from the 1940s dressed in drag, as women are not allowed to perform in kabuki theater, so traditionally the men portray female characters. These characters are called onagata, and the men are, Maruyama says, quite fetching and beautiful. So we're looking at cabinets here that have been scanned and collaged with fish, octopus found objects, and incorporated into wooden frames. So you're looking at something that is, it is a functional cabinet, but it's much more. She's really relying on the sort of exposure and hidden nature that a cabinet or a piece of case furniture can offer, and playing that up to provide meaning. So taking the form of studio furniture and doing something quite compelling with it. More recent bodies of work of Maruyama's speak to the explicitly political, and a series of works examine Franklin Roosevelt's 1942 Executive Order number 9066. Maruyama actually showed this work in Boston at the Society of Arts and Crafts in 2012, and so I'm hoping some of you might have seen that exhibition. In an atmosphere of World War II hysteria, Roosevelt was encouraged by officials at all levels of the federal government and authorized the internment of tens of thousands of American citizens of Japanese ancestry and resident aliens from Japan, giving the military broad powers to ban any citizen from a 50 to 60 mile wide coastal area stretching from Washington state to California and extending inland to Arizona. The order also authorized transporting these citizens to assembly centers hastily set up and governed by the military in those states, as well as Oregon. Maruyama's first visual experience of this event was initially through the images of documentary photographers Dorothea Lange and Toto Miyatake, and I'm showing Lange on the left and Miyatake on the right. Her family was directly affected by the evacuation, but little was mentioned of this by her mother or grandparents. And it was heavily veiled, this chapter in her family history. And because of it, she says, I avoided any association with this connection, partially out of suppressed anger and partially out of just wanting to move forward. But we might think about the sort of feminist chestnut that the personal is political. And when awarded an artist in residency opportunity at SUNY Purchase in the fall of 2008, she decided to immerse herself in research and investigation into the executive order and this sort of effect on the Japanese American psyche. And new work really deals with that material. So I'm showing here a series of wall-mounted cabinets alluding to themes common within the internment camps. They include documentary photographs like the ones we've just touched on, alongside barbed wire, tar paper, and domestic objects. They also display actual objects owned or made by the internees in these camps, including suitcases used by families during their relocation and items made by materials available in the camp. And so in the small hand-carved bird in this piece in the lower right corner, titled Sweet Bird, was made between 1942 and 1945 by an unknown Japanese American who was incarcerated in the prisoner camp called Minidanka in Idaho. Bird pins were made of scrap lumber that was found in the camps, as well as wire that was used to cover barrack windows. And so artists use images of birds found in old copies of National Geographic magazine as their models. A companion piece, the Tag Project, consists of 120,000 replicas of the paper tags Japanese internees were forced to wear during relocation. And so this is an interesting example of taking her training in studio furniture and thinking about scale and moving it into a sculptural realm. The tags were grouped into bundles representing each one of the camps and suspended from the ceiling, and their purpose is to display the sheer mass of those displaced, as well as to evoke a sense of humiliation endured by the Japanese internees. And so the making of this project involved the help of hundreds of community members to handwrite all the names of the Japanese prisoners on the tags. Maruyama's interest in social action continues through her most recent series, which is titled The Wildlife Project. It was inspired by a trip to Kenya, where she met with wildlife advocates to learn more about the dangers of poaching animals. Her work draws attention to the wrongful slaughter of elephants and rhinoceroses for the harvest of their tusks for the $10 billion annually ivory industry, and places special interest on the unique social nature of elephants and their similarities to humans. So in this installation, the elephant is memorialized in a sort of monumental form through wood constructions that tower between 8 and 12 feet. Surfaces finished in various gray to brick red earth tones, constructed from panels of wood and held together with string, so not sort of the typical furniture construction she would have learned. However, the challenge for Maruyama was to resolve how she could make such large forms without the weight and mass that one would normally encounter. And since she used to sew clothing when she was a teenager, she adapted a pattern-making technique that would allow her to work with thin, lightweight pieces of wood and hand-stitch them together in a way that the form would become three-dimensional when hung on the wall. Maruyama notes also that the process was remarkably therapeutic for her and cathartic. The process of stitching these pieces became an act of trying to fix a very complex problem. She crafted, and I think you can see it in this image here, a wooden reliquary to house large hand-blown glass tusks, which I'm showing a close-up of here, symbolizing the preciousness of the elephant and the ivory for which it is sourced. As an artist in residence at the Pilchuck Glass School in 2013, she worked with professional glass blowers on the creation of these pieces. The final piece in the Wildlife Project makes the connections between furniture and memorials, like coffins and sarcophagi. At some point in history, the designs of these two seemingly disparate classes of object were intertwined, and she really looks to that history. She's adapted a Buddhist altar, complete with objects that have different meanings, and in the context of the exhibition, the central object of reverence or worship is the elephant, and among the items present on the altar, flowers are used to represent the impermanence of this gentle and majestic animal. A candle is placed on the altar to symbolize unchanging truth. Incense is burned as an offering in an attempt to capture the spiritual state in the present moment. And there's a Buddhist-style bell, a bell shrine with burning incense and the bronze bell that you see here. The bell sounds every 15 minutes to represent how often an elephant is killed for its tusks. So an artist here who took her role as the first woman to earn this master's degree in furniture making and made a remarkable set of contributions to the larger field. And she has just recently retired from teaching at San Diego State University. So many furniture makers have her to thank for their education and careers. The last artist I want to delve into with a longer case study is Sonya Clark, a fiber artist and the chair of the Craft and Material Studies Department at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond. Some of you may remember her from projects at the MFA in 2015 in conjunction with Crafted Objects in Flux. I hope that you do. After receiving her BA from Amherst College, where Clark focused on psychology, she received a BFA from the Art Institute of Chicago and an MFA from Cranbrook Academy of Art. Her work has struck a chord, and she's exhibited internationally in over 250 solo group and museum exhibitions and appears in collections including our own. Clark made the decision to focus on textiles because, like most craft-based media, humans have been expressing themselves through textiles for thousands and thousands of years. And because these materials have been used most often by women to make utilitarian objects, audiences have been not only interacting with them for many, many generations, but often undervaluing and underassuming what they could do and the power that they could hold for many generations, and she really takes advantage of that. As a fiber artist who profoundly embraces textile history and the notions of the decorative, Clark depends on the work of women artists from the 1970s like Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro, who criticized modern art for its celebration of the values and aesthetics that privileged white male experience and interest as a universal idea. And like many feminist peers, those artists began to incorporate and emphasize craft practices shunned under modernism because of its association with femininity. So things like the decorative, the ornamental, the domestic, and the amateur. And I thought while I'm mentioning this relationship, I might as well bring up an exhibition that's about to open March 22nd, so I hope that you have a chance to see this if you're in New York at the Museum of Arts and Design. So again, we are coming around full circle to look at the decorative after Miriam Shapiro, and so highlighting and privileging this notion of the decorative, the feminine, in contemporary works of art. In her artist statement, Clark notes, "I use craft and materials to investigate identity." And I think this work, Afro Abe, from 2010 is a really wonderful example of that. And I want you to sort of look at this work and think about it while I read some of Clark's own statement about her practice. "Simple objects can become cultural interfaces. Through them, I navigate accord and discord. When trying to unravel complex issues, I'm instinctively drawn to things that connect to my personal narrative as a point of departure, a comb or a strand of hair. Charged with agency, simple objects have the mysterious ability to reflect or absorb us. But it's also the object's ability to act as a rhizome, the multiple ways in which it can be discovered or read by a wide audience that draws me in. To sustain my practice, I milk the object, its potential, its image, its materiality. I manipulate the object in a formal manner to engage the viewer in conversation about collective meaning. Can a strand of hair tell a life story or a whole cultural history? I would argue that the hair here does quite a bit. I trust that my stories, your stories, our stories are held in an object. In this way, the everyday thing becomes a lens through which we may better see one another." Clark grew up in a home with her grandmother, a professional tailor, which instilled an early interest in the handmade and a love of craft in her. She was born to parents from Trinidad and Jamaica, but has roots in West African and the Yoruba culture in particular, and visited Africa, the Ivory Coast, for the first time in 1989, where she apprenticed herself to a local weaver and learned narrow loom strip weaving as well as batik and tie-dye traditions. And she links her urge to make directly to this kind of African heritage. She has said, and I'm quoting here, "Slaves removed from Africa may have arrived apparently empty-handed, but in fact their hands held memories of particular ways of working, making, and moving materials. And as a medium, fiber permits me to claim my place in the African textile continuum." So this notion that we come with knowledge in our hands. Drawing on these roots, no pun intended, Sonja Clark incorporates the hair of African and African-American women and culturally associated hair braiding techniques into textile form and sculptural object. And these symbolic and innovative interpretations of materials and weaving processes explore layered historical and intergenerational contexts of racial identity, disenfranchisement, and definitions of beauty. And they often look to female progenitors for their content. A key piece of hers depicts Madam C.J. Walker. I'm showing a photograph here, and then that photograph, as it's been incorporated into the cover of Madam C.J. Walker's Handbook of Beauty, Happiness, and Success, things that we all want. Walker made her fortune selling beauty products in the early 1900s to Black women, desperate to counter cultural notions of quote-unquote bad hair that found no recourse in the larger marketplace. And she's also the first self-made female millionaire, so did quite well for herself. With the help of computer pixelation, Clark has actually used the positive lines of combs, which you can see in a close-up here. She has, in some cases, taken the teeth of the combs out and used it to create a portrait of this American icon. Some earlier works of Clark's, so I'm showing here Wig from 1997, give an idea of how broadly hairdressing fiber and African art history have played a long-standing role in her practice. She's written about this work, noting that hairdressing is the first art made of fiber. The head is a sacred place where cultural influences are absorbed, siphoned, and retained, and the site where we process the world through the senses. The sculptural headdresses I create are metaphorical funnels for the fluidity of cultural heritage and cultural melding. And so here she's paying homage to Nigerian thread-wrapped hairstyles through using thread-wrapping techniques. I'm showing a close-up of that here to create the sort of trunk and branch forms of the tree-like form that comes off of this wearable piece. In a work like Kente Cloth from 2011, Clark takes the combs that we've already seen as a signifier in her previous work and uses them as a structural element around which various colored threads can be wrapped. I'm showing an image of that here. And she makes an unconventional take on the patterning and materials that make more typical Ghanaian strip-woven kente cloths and engenders a subtle connection to this larger work about hair. In her kente flag, so kente cloth is a theme in other pieces as well, as is the American flag. We'll see that a little bit later too. She created a hybrid cultural object that married the kente cloth with the American flag and thought about both of them as symbols of identity and pride. Kente patterns for strength, endurance, advancement, achievement, and prosperity were woven into this flag. And the piece was performative and connected to other women's identities as well. She asked 50 African-American women to wrap their heads in the kente flag and be photographed, and to talk about their feelings about kente cloth, the American flag, and the term African-American. And so we'll see that social practice is also a big part of Sonya's work. I'm going to just briefly go through the piece that's in the MFA's collection, which we acquired in 2015, the Haircraft Project, which if you know this piece and you were looking, was recently mentioned in a really wonderful op-ed in the New York Times just about 2 weeks ago called Black Hair's Blockbuster Moment. So this is a work that was in the Crafted Objects in Flux exhibition where Sonya worked with a number of hairdressers in her hometown of Richmond, Virginia, over the course of a year and asked all of them to do their best work on the back of her head. And so I'm showing here her untreated hair and then what all of the individuals' hairdressers did. And then on canvases primed with silk thread. And so it's the exact same textile techniques, but a different context. And she really allows that to open up questions about how we value different kinds of hand-making techniques. Where is the value in craft as it's associated to context? Here, this is what the canvases look like before the hairdressers were given the opportunity to do their work. So you see just long strands of silk. Showing those canvases here as they were in the exhibition in 2015. And the photographs that not only show the back of Sonya's head, she wore each hairstyle for about a month and walked through the world with it and was sort of a living gallery for these women's artwork. But we also see the face of the hairstylist, the face of the maker, and so this kind of invisible labor. And most textile work throughout history is indeed invisible labor. It's very rare that we have a woman, usually a woman's name, associated with that work. She's giving not just names, but faces to that work and valuing what's on the canvas as much as what's on her head. We invited Sonya in 2015, and I'm hoping that some of you may have been here for this, to do a performance in the museum in relationship to some of the works in our African art collection. And so she particularly picked a piece, this is on view right now, headdress from Sierra Leone that shows a very elaborate hairstyle. And we worked with a really wonderful hairstylist based in Malden, Kathy Montreville. Sonya asked Kathy, over the course of a 6-hour period, to interpret the hairstyle as it was depicted by the artist in that sculpture on Sonya's head in the gallery. And so it took about 6 hours. And Sonya talked to a crowd of people who came to watch the whole time, and the questions ranged. They spoke to everything from African-American identity to the beauty processes and rituals that we go through as women to present ourselves to the world and what it means to do that in a public space, to the actual technical processes of what Kathy was doing with Sonya's hair. How do you do this kind of braiding? How do you do this kind of wrapping? How do you get the hair to stand up? How did you make the translation as an artist from this sculpture, which doesn't really depict the hairstyle, but it depicts an artist rendering of the hairstyle. This is not like a how-to manual to the final product. So really, really interesting work of Sonya's that not only speaks to these relationships with textile history, but also brings in female makers like Kathy, who are craftspeople, who are artists, but are not necessarily valued in the same way that somebody who is more traditionally a part of the art world is valued, and certainly don't often get to see their craft within the context of something like the MFA Boston. So more recently, Sonya's works dealing with the Confederate flag have gotten a great deal of attention, particularly in the charged political climate that we're in now. She deals with it both as a symbol and as a textile object, and here you'll notice that she has braided that kind of symbolic stand-in for hair, those silk threads, into the Confederate flag. I'm going to show you a couple of different variations on this symbol that she's done recently. She's noted that racial injustice is something every American contends with, either consciously or unconsciously, and it's so deeply embedded in the fabric of our nation that the word racism, she notes, is sort of like a trigger word. It can shut people's ears off, shut people down, bring people's defense mechanisms up. I'm less interested in that and more interested in picking apart and undoing it. Here she's done that literally, where she's undone a Confederate flag and a US flag and actually woven them together. She's understanding the literal fabric of our nation and trying to understand the roots of racial injustice. And so her performative work, Unraveling, which was done for the first time in 2015, she carefully unraveled a Confederate flag thread by thread in the context of the museum gallery, and this is at the Speed Museum in Louisville, in Kentucky. She invited members of the public to join her in that process. With each participant, she takes a few moments to explain the process she's envisioned for deconstructing the flag. She suggests where and how to pull strands apart, and they work together. She engages with participants, asking them about themselves and what drew them to the project, ending each interaction with an embrace. She stands side by side with participants, shoulder to shoulder, as they pull each strand of the flag and confront the sort of reality that it represents. She deliberately doesn't use tools in this process, and she has people concentrate on the pulling apart of the thread manually with one finger, so you can see that happening there. Participants with experience with fiber, even well-established fiber artists, have difficulty extracting each and every thread by hand because she picks these flags for their remarkable craftsmanship, for the care that somebody has actually taken in putting them together. The works in these performances rarely yield a completely deconstructed flag, although she's previously shown them alongside the performances, as you're seeing in this image here. They reveal the sort of sense of the difficulty of such a task, the persistence it requires, and illustrates how we've progressed in the actual action of people coming together to dismantle this side by side. Craft is essential to the entire conversation. So really important and interesting work that takes this feminine assumed feminine labor of textiles and really upends it in all sorts of interesting ways. I'll mention too, as I said in the beginning, that Sonya is also a revered teacher. She was recently honored with the James Renwick Alliance of the Smithsonian Institution's Teaching Award, and has lots of really wonderful students of all genders who have learned from her and studied with her. So to end today, I want to briefly touch on two younger contemporary female artists making crafts objects in the museum's collection that build on the remarkable achievements of their predecessors. Each speaks directly to some themes about what it means to be a woman in today's world, not just a woman working in craft. And so I'm showing here an image from a profile of the artist Vivian Beer in American Craft magazine. Again, we'll keep coming back to Aileen Osborn Webb. Beer was born in 1977. She's one of the brightest rising stars in today's studio furniture world. She grew up in a rural setting in Maine and says that the development of hand skills and tools were a part of her everyday life. And she studied sculpture and worked as a production blacksmith before training further in metalsmithing at Cranbrook Academy of Art. She notes that she's chosen metal as her partner in crime in the studio because of its inherent physical and cultural attributes, as well as her intimate relationship with its forming and fabrication. The physical process of making, the work, it's all part of her design and research process. And so I'm showing her here teaching a workshop on forming aluminum. Her understanding of industry is a direct result of teaching techniques. So you'll notice she doesn't make sort of small scale metals like jewelry, but she makes large scale pieces, furniture. And she's seen herself in relationship to industrial production and design. So these are areas of making that women were often, in addition to large-scale metals, thought of as not being able to be part of. And so you can not only see, but you can use Beer's work upstairs in the Lindy family wing. We commissioned her in 2013 to do Anchored Candy number 5. It's the first commission to enter the museum's Please Be Seated program in over 10 years. It seduces the sitter through its voluptuous and elongated form, its brilliant color, and its glittering finish. And this was actually, in producing this work for the MFA, the first time that Beer used a dual pearlescent tone. So you can see that there's a sort of green and a blue here, and that is within the paint itself. So she was able to experiment a little bit in doing the commission for us because we had natural light in the space. She meticulously uses materials we may not always associate with furniture, studio furniture, like steel and aluminum and automotive finish, to reference manifestations of craft that appear in popular culture. And so we look at this piece and we might think of the handwork necessary to restore the sleek surface of a classic hot rod, again, not the typical realm of women. Or we might think about the curvature of sort of a couture high heel, which is where women are expected to be. I'm showing here work by Melanie Belenker, born in 1978. This is a piece, the garden brooch, from the MFA's collection. She translates the historic Victorian art of hair jewelry into work that reflects upon not only the sort of contemporary era, but also speaks to valuing moments in women's lives that we don't typically value. We have here a wearable art object that depicts a sort of ordinary moment of everyday life through a drawing made from resin, gold, silver, and the artist's own hair. So each individual thin strand here is a piece of hair. Two additional works that again show these moments that we don't even think to memorialize. They're not special, right? We've turned off the water in the tub, we're curled up in bed, maybe on a Sunday morning. Belenker notes, I secure my memories through photographic images rendered in lines of my own hair, physical remnants. I do not reproduce events, but quiet minutes, the mundane, the domestic, the ordinary moments. By making these in hair brooches, which are traditionally a form that were used to remember a loved one, she is arguing that we need to remember these moments of our everyday lives, the private moments in each of our lives as a woman. And in this sense, and in really the simple quality of her drawings with hair, I often think about her work in the context of the work of another trailblazing woman artist, known for depicting intimate and domestic scenes of women. I'm showing here The Tub and the Coiffure by Mary Cassatt, two really beautiful prints that are in the MFA's collection. So looking at Vivian Beer's work, looking at Melanie Belenker's work, we have somebody who is very much involved with the world, still in the domain of men, really making her strides as a woman in craft through that language, and an artist who is saying, I want to be intimate, I want to look at the everyday moments of my own life and value them, and that is how I am building my own sense of value as a woman in the artistic world. So two really interesting paths that these artists can take, and the fact that they can choose to take them is quite remarkable. So 6 stories here of female artists and art supporters, and we can see a spectrum through which women's voices have shaped studio craft and continue to do so. I hope that you leave today, not just from this lecture, but all the lectures that you've heard over the duration of this course, inspired to seek out the tremendous female artists contributing to this field today, and to learn the stories of those who have made it what it is. Thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions. So there's microphones on either side of the room.
I just wondered how the women's colleges in this country contributed to the studio craft movement. I know some of them still have strong programs and book arts at Wellesley or wheel throwing at Scripps.
Yep.
How did that tie in?
So there's a number of different stories connected to different women's colleges. It's not sort of one for one, but we might think of Newcomb College ceramics. We might think of even the ceramics program at Harvard that came out of Radcliffe. Certainly, women's colleges were often at the forefront of seeing the value in these programs, but they were often non-academic programs that were later maybe incorporated into the academic programming of the university, or say in the case of something like the Harvard ceramics program, that's still not an academic program. You still can't get a degree in ceramics from Harvard, but you can study there, and it certainly does impact a number of the students that come through the university, and certainly in their relationship, say, with the Graduate School of Design, it's become a very influential place. So absolutely a big part of this story.
How did you get interested in this in the first place? Because I love your energy, and that was such a beautiful presentation. I'm just curious. No one else has any more questions.
I think so. I first began to be interested in crafts as through fiber, because I was really interested in many ways the same reasons that Sonja Clark became interested in it. It's accessibility, the role that women had to play in its making, and came through it from there. But I think studio craft is remarkable because women have played this role, this larger role of parody from the get-go, even though we often do hear men's stories first. And so I found that rewarding as I've continued to engage with it. But certainly decorative arts have always interested me because of their relationship to everyday life.
Looks like there's one question in the back.
Yeah, I have one. Can you talk a little bit about folk art and how that connects or doesn't connect to what you've been talking about?
Yeah, so I'm mostly, with the exception of sort of some of the early things that were shown at America House and through Putnam County Products, I'm really talking about studio craft, which is outside of the realm of folk art. It's largely professionalized. It's artists who are engaging in sort of an art community. I think folk art has often emerged as a sort of parallel narrative, but it's not necessarily. I think there are many studio craft artists who are inspired by folk art, but it's a different, the sort of level of professionalization and training and the intentions for different kinds of circles of sales and promotion sort of run parallel, but not often together. But certainly for somebody like Webb at the beginning of her career, thinking about something like Putnam County Products, I don't know that the distinctions would have been there in the same kind of way. This increased professionalization sort of came later down the line.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. And
Thank
thanks for
you.
coming today, everyone.